This morning I'm going to start with a confession, and that is that I know the weakest part of my preaching is generally connecting what I'm preaching about to the practical application. I've known that for many years. I keep working on it, but I still struggle trying to figure those pieces out and keep working on getting that better. That also is permission that if you think something would work, let me know. That is always helpful. Now, part of that is just I'm really bad at doing that because I have conversations in my head and forget to share them out loud. Emily's going, you don't know how much. But the other part of that is that what doesn't help me out a whole lot in this is that we live in a time when so much of the way that we used to do things doesn't seem to work anymore. So a lot of those natural connections just aren't there. Or worse yet, we're finding out that the way we used to do things didn't ever really work all that well before, but it sure looked pretty. Or we're finding out that in many ways we didn't do a great job of teaching others about our faith, and that even that we ourselves weren't formed in faith like we thought we were. If there is something that describes what the last 30 years of faith formation, I think that's it, is that we've been struggling for a while. All of the research that I see coming out, and more importantly, the stories I hear folks that tell me is that for a long time we weren't formed in the ways that we thought we needed to be, and to really be able to rely on our faith in good times and in bad. We have folks that are really good at finding things in the Bible but don't understand a lot of what they're reading. We have folks that can put up lots of inspirational messages and use inspirational words but lack depth. We have folks that know rigid dogma and doctrine but have no flexibility, so come across as harsh and angry all the time. And we have others that are so flexible but that they can touch their toes with their elbows, but they have no rigidity or doctrine, so you never know quite where they believe or where they stand. And before you think I've got one particular group in mind for any of those, I don't. I've seen folks across all the spectrum in all of those different places. But do you know what else I've seen? And this is why I keep doing what it is that I do. Because God keeps showing me, and it has to be that God is showing me this, because Emily can tell you, I am not the most observant of people a lot of times. If I get really focused on a task, I'm going to lose everything else. That's why you don't necessarily always want me paying attention to things while I'm driving. I can focus on the road or I can look at pretty scenery. I can't do both. That's just kind of where I am. But I've watched folks. What I've seen, though, is people that are looking. I've seen folks that are searching. Even the folks, and I've been one of these at different times that I described before, I've seen them where they are, for the most part, very earnest and trying and wanting to do what is good and right. And often we have been far from perfect in doing it, but you can feel the desire to be good, to be well, to help others, to do better, to be authentic, and to be real in our faith. And that makes all the difference. The desire is there. The searching for God is still there. The joy in helping others is still there. The hope for the future is, that's the part that we struggle with. That's the thing that clouds everything else. If there was something that connected all of those issues last week where I was intentionally trying to step on everyone's toes, if there is something that connects all of those things together, that's it. Is that our hope for the future is sometimes hard to find. Throughout the season of Lent, we're on this journey back to Eden, not back to the literal garden, but back to the relationship that we had with God back then. Or better yet, back to a relationship with God that is like what we had back then, but is built brand new because we are not the same people that we were then. We are on a journey to find that same but different relationship. Or in good theological terms, we'd say we're on that journey to find that already but not yet relationship with God. But to get there, we have to commit ourselves to something that is very different, to a very different journey. So let's talk more about what that journey is. Let's talk about clashes between leaders. Some that are in charge with formal power, others that have been anointed, some that are afraid of their positions being stolen away from them, others that are terrified of what all of that means, Some that have no clue that what they're doing, but they're putting a brave face on, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're sitting there thinking to yourselves, preacher, you're going back into stepping on toes again. I'm not deliberately trying to do that by vague referencing leaders that are around us today, but I'm describing David, Saul, and Samuel as we pick up our scripture passage for this morning. If you happen to hear something else in that, it's partially intentional, but mostly it's a way of saying that there is nothing new under the sun, that what goes around comes around, what we're seeing now we've seen before, and that we will see again. That is part of just the world that we are in. And so we pick up our scripture reading for this morning. This is the part of the story where Saul has been anointed as king. He is in fact king, and he had zero clue about what he was doing. But he was king. So by golly, he had to act kingly. And so he was doing his best to be all of the king that he could be. And Saul was being exactly the king that Samuel told the Israelites that they were going to get. If you remember Samuel's description of that, that was not a very generous description of what a king was going to be. So why did they want him? They wanted a king. They didn't know who it was going to be, but they wanted a king because they were afraid. They were looking to a future where all of the other little nations that were around them, all of them had kings. And they looked like they were doing better, and so therefore they must be better. And so you have one part plus the second part. Well, obviously that's how that all got there. And so they wanted a king also. By golly, they needed one so that they could be in such a great shape as everyone else was around them. And so they begged and they pleaded with Samuel to get God to give them a king. And so here they are, with exactly the king that they asked for. And Saul is slowly, throughout the entirety of his reign, sliding into madness and paranoia. Ultimately, that's going to end with his death. He dies in battle, but what kills him is his own paranoia, is his own ability to do anything else. And we'll see him from this point out. He'll be running at shadows. He'll be chasing after David. He is going to be doing all sorts of crazy things. And meanwhile, even though Samuel had a very prominent place in Israelite society, even though he was the last judge over Israel, so like a proto-king, he commanded a great deal of respect, he was afraid of Saul. He was concerned about Saul, what he would do if Saul knew that God had told Samuel to go and to anoint a new king in his place. Samuel was concerned about what Saul would do to him. But God tells Samuel, go down to Bethlehem, find Jesse, and I'm going to show you one of his sons that you're going to anoint as the new king. Samuel's concerned, but with a little bit of approved subterfuge from God, goes down to Bethlehem. And he goes to Jesse's family, and he starts looking at his sons. And the first son comes up, Eliab is there, and Samuel thinks to himself, oh, this is the firstborn son. He looks very kingly. This has got to be the one that God has called and wants me to anoint as king. Because, why not? This is how this is supposed to work, right? But we get this next verse, and I love this verse. But the Lord said to Samuel, have no regard for his appearance or stature, because I haven't selected him. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see only what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart. We can and should do a couple of things with this verse. One is deeply profound and beautiful, and this is what we normally do with this verse. We hear that last part where humans see only what is visible, but God sees into the heart, which is in one way terrifying because God sees into the very being of who we are, but also is incredibly comforting because finally at least we know someone out there gets us. Someone knows us. Even if no one else does, we know that God is there, and that can be freeing, and that can be hopeful, and that can be deeply beautiful. The other thing we should do, though, is ask a question. Why does God look into the heart? Because he doesn't look at things the way that humans do, like we do. In fact, in our lectionary readings for this Sunday. The gospel reading comes out of John 9, and it is, we would have read that one this morning, but that was verses 1 to 41. And I think Sydney probably would have revolted against me if I tried to do that. And you really need to read all 41 verses of this story. So if you need somewhere to read this week, go to John 9, read verses 1 to 41. Read that whole story because Jesus is there. This is the story of the blind man who Jesus healed. And Jesus was asked by the disciples at the start of the story. They see this blind man who had been blind from birth, mind you, so they know this going in. And they ask the question of Jesus. They say, well, Jesus, who sinned so that this man would be born blind? Was it his parents or was it him? Think about the logic of that for a second. Question is, because these were both valid possibilities to them, what could the man possibly have done that was so egregious that he was retroactively made blind from birth, or that it was so egregious in the womb that he was born blind? Think about that. I hate to say it, but I was this many years old before I realized just kind of the logic of that whole thing. Jesus looks at that and is beginning to shake his head as he's beginning to teach folks a different lesson. As human people, more explicitly since the time of the Enlightenment and the development of logic as a philosophical science, but really through the entirety of our history, we have been a people of logic. We are mostly one-dimensional, but if something has happened, then obviously something caused it to happen. Everything then is structured such that there is always a cause and a reaction to life, and life then becomes a series of if-then statements. If this happens, then that must obviously happen after that. If I eat a donut, then I will gain 10 pounds. True story. That's how you end up with a man being born blind, possibly also being the cause of his own blindness. There was the great philosopher Ray Stevens that one time had just as useful a series of logic in there. He one time wrote a song called "And I'm My Own Grandpa." And we'll link to that in the email this week in case you need a chuckle. But it makes as much sense here in this situation. The crazy part of this is that Jesus is telling everyone that it makes as much sense for someone to be their own grandpa as it makes for this man being born blind because of his own sin. We see logic. We see things that have happened in the past. We see the result of those things in the present, and then those things will give way to what happens in the future. This is how we see things. This is how the world works for us. We go back just to basic high school algebra, right? A plus B equals C. This is how the world works. And the hard part of this is that everything in our society is structured to get us to see, including our faith, as it has often been handed down to us. You're born, you get baptized, you go to Sunday school, you go to confirmation, you join the church, you graduate from high school, you go off to school, you get married, you start a family, your kids are born, they're baptized, they go to Sunday school. You see, this is how high school algebra works, doesn't it? A plus B equals C. C becomes your new A for the next equation, and then the cycle repeats itself over and over and over again. This is where we go. And have you ever felt that sometimes it feels like we get out so far ahead of ourselves and we wonder, where is God in the midst of all of this? That we know how the story goes, we see the equation, and then we know, because we know it, we can predict how it is all going to happen again and again and again. And have you ever pushed so hard that you stop and you take stock of where we are and we wonder how we got there and where is everyone else? That's where Samuel was with Saul and the Israelites. And that's where we can feel like we are now. We've pushed so hard and we've gotten so far out that we don't know where we are, and if we aren't careful, it can almost feel like we've left God behind, which then leads to the next set of problems, because we're going to repeat that same cycle over again, because this all comes out of fear and concern and worry and anxiety, and so we repeat the same process over because we look at this, we get out someplace where we aren't familiar and we don't know what's going on, and we say, ooh, we don't know what to do here, so we start asking questions. Who's in charge? Who's going to set the tone and the agenda? Who's going to get everyone ready? Who's going to wake up the kids in the morning so that they can go to school? Who's going to change the laundry over? Who's going to do this project at work? Who's going to make sure that the taxes get filed? Who's going to make sure that no one pushes the button and starts nuclear Armageddon? Who's going to make sure that we go grocery shopping this week? Like, this is all the craziness that comes into this. All of those things begin to feed into this because we think we know how this story goes. Because we're always pushing towards that end result. Because we say, this is what happens, and that has to happen, and that has to happen. Multiply that by several billion people, and is it any wonder that we're having mental health issues? Is it any wonder that we live in an uncertain world? Is it any wonder that we might feel uneasy? The answer for the church is to say, well, we just got to get people back in the pews, right? I mean, I'm guilty of saying that. And then here's how we do that, though. Here's how we make that work. We say, we need to get people back into the pews. Here's the program that we're going to use. Here's how we're going to implement this. And we want to make sure we get X number of people back into the pews by Christmas of next year or by the start of school or whatever it is. And we work to make that happen. And then we get to that time frame and say, well, we didn't quite get there. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to put together a new program so that we can try and get that in there. So we can do that all over again, right? We find ourselves often in a place, I wouldn't even say that we're out ahead of everyone else, but in a different place from where we should be, and it feels lonely and isolating all over again. So where do we break the cycle? That becomes the hard part. Go back to this silly little equation that I have up here. A plus B equals C. I left it up there for a reason, because this is society as we find ourselves, always pushing to C in this silly little equation. And the solution to this goes back to a silly little song that I sang part of several weeks ago, but is one that we know. He's got the whole world in his hands. I won't sing the rest of it because I'll mess up the words. And excuse the bad artwork, it's better than my hand-drawn one. So you get the computer-generated one. We have to reframe our thinking. And this is the hard part. We have to step outside of that pushing and of that cycle that we find ourselves in. The place that we start is we have to look at the world differently. We have to tell ourselves that on every single time we think about it, that we have to see things differently. We have to work differently. Because the cycle is easy. The cycle is what we know, and it is enticing. The cycle started when we left the garden. That's when it began. When we left that original relationship with God, then we were out on our own, and we had to figure out, how do we control the world around us? How do we manipulate the world around us so that we can survive? It comes from a natural place. How do we get to see? How do we get there? So we go through the cycle. We have to let go of the cycle. God holds not just us, but our past, our present, and our future in his hands, and we can't get out ahead of him. We live our lives constantly held by him, and so for the false sense of urgency that the world tells us we must have, God says, urgency can't get you away from me, and it's not bigger than I am. Telling ourselves that this is the world we live in takes off our shoulders the need to push forward and to predict the next thing that comes our way. And by the way, we're bad at that. Just ask a good finance expert, what's better, a passive or an actively managed stock fund? The passively managed one will beat over time, always does better. No matter how smart you are, no matter how good you are, you can get some short-term gain, but over the long term, you set it and forget it. It's where you want to leave your money. And why does that happen? Because we don't know things. We're missing a lot of information. And when we're always trying to push into someplace different, and when we do that without guidance and without support, and when we try to logic our way into things, we get lost. And we end up in the absurdity of a Ray Stevens world. So we have to change the way we see the world. Not that we then go out and we tell everyone, hey, we've got it figured out. Here's how you need to see the world. If you just do things like we do, then we're okay. Months us back into the cycle all over again. But we start living in that new worldview. That means that we have to let go of a lot of things. And these aren't the things that we normally would think of, but these are the things that we have to let go of. We have to let go of the things that are out of our control, that never were in our control, and that are never ours to control. Those are harder. Because those are the things that we think that we have to hold on to so that we can get to that next place. This is the importance of prayer, because it's the time when we go to God most regularly to let go of our need to push, to let go of our need to control the things that we can't control, so that we can see the world that he wants to show us. The world is far more beautiful than the one that we are trying to push into. Also, the world is far more stable than the one that we are trying to push into. And that what we're really afraid of is falling. That's why we keep pushing that far. We're afraid that if we let go of all these things, then we're going to fall. But then when we switch to this new place, we realize that, one, we're never falling far, because God is always there to catch us. And then after a while, we realize that we're never actually falling. We're just seeing things differently. And then we realize that we never needed to push to begin with. This is the lesson that Samuel was learning, where he was wrapping up his worry and his concern and his fear, and yet God was still there with a way for him to do exactly as was needed. This is the lesson that literally everyone in this story that Jesus runs across, the blind man, his parents, his disciples, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the folks that are gathered around it, the people in the town where the blind man lives, all of them are, Jesus is trying to teach this lesson in the story of the blind man. Because the truth is that we don't need to push, and we're still going to get there. But we can get there stronger and more confident if we let go of our need to push and know that God will take us there anyway. And we can do that without that added stress and anxiety. That's our hope. That's as we are making our way into this journey to get back to Eden. That's the relationship that we're wanting to come back to, where we trust God so much. We put our faith in him that we see the world as he is showing it to us, so that we let go of our need to push and know that he is still going to take us to where we need to be. But we can do it with strength and with confidence and with hope that we are missing so much of. Let us, as we go out into this world, go knowing that Jesus goes with us, that the reason he came was to show us that this is still possible, and that we can go and we can live that life. Let us go and let us do that in Christ's name. Amen.